Question: how does someone who has taken on the fallen consciousness due to immense abuse from a parent eradicate it out of one's being? Well, I think we need to start making a distinction here. Because it's easy to misunderstand the idea of the fallen consciousness and think that anytime human beings are doing unkind things to each other, it comes from the fallen consciousness. That isn't necessarily the case. As just one example of this, in Denmark where I grew up, you go back to my grandparents' generation, 100 years ago or so, and it was common that children were beaten. They were beaten by their parents, they were beaten in school, the teachers had this cane out of a bamboo stick that they used to beat the children with in school, and it was systematic. And this wasn't considered abuse back then. It was just part of the culture. And you can of course say, where does this kind of abuse ultimately come from? And maybe ultimately you can say it came from the fallen beings, but still that doesn't mean that all of the people who were engaging in this were in the fallen consciousness. It was just the culture was that way. And it's like they say, a person who has been abused can have a higher risk of becoming an abuser because you get stuck in the pattern. You just repeat the pattern. And even back then, my grandparents, they thought it was normal to beat children. It was just necessary. In Danish society today, it's illegal because society has moved forward. But so I'm just trying to make a distinction here between human behavior that can clearly be abusive, but it doesn't necessarily mean it comes from the fallen consciousness. So what is the fallen consciousness? Well, in terms of this, I would say that the fallen consciousness is where there is a deliberate intent to control other people and a willingness to destroy the people who will not be controlled. I would say that's more of a sign of the fallen consciousness. And perhaps this is what the person asking the question experienced. I obviously don't know, since I don't know the person personally. So I'm just saying, be careful by thinking that you have taken on the fallen consciousness. Because it may just be that you have a trauma as a result of abuse. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have taken on the fallen consciousness. So, but anyway, how do you then overcome it? Well, the fallen consciousness is what? I mean, you can look at it in an impersonal way and say it's a certain state of consciousness that has certain characteristics, as I just described, a couple of them. But there's more to it, of course, because there's a deliberate rebellion against the purpose of creation. There's a deliberate denial of the Christ in yourself. So there's more to it. But so the fallen consciousness can be described in general terms as a certain state of consciousness that has these characteristics. But when it comes to the personal level, that you have taken on the fallen consciousness, you do this by creating these subconscious selves that are based on the illusion of separation, which is an aspect, or which is basically what leads to the fallen consciousness. So the process for freeing yourself from it is the one I've described in several of my breakthrough videos, and in the book Healing Your Spiritual Traumas, that you come to identify the self, you come to see that it's not you. You have taken on the self like you take on an overcoat, but you haven't become the self. The conscious you, which is the core of your being, you have not become the self. And therefore you can come to see that it's just a foreign element that you have taken on. It's based on an illusion. And when you see the illusion, by contacting the one mind, the Christ mind, you can let the self die. And this is the process. I mean, you can say, no matter how severe of a fallen consciousness you have taken on, this is the process for freeing yourself from it. Now, as I've explained in several videos, there's a distinction to be made between fallen beings and people who have taken on the fallen consciousness. Because, as I described in my video about how the world was created, a fallen being is one who has been, who has experienced the ascended masters, showing that being what is real and unreal in its own consciousness. And then the fallen being has deliberately denied this, rejected this. And that's why the fallen being can fall from one sphere to the next. So there are beings who are in our sphere, some are in embodiment on earth, some are in the emotional, mental, and identity realms, who fell in a previous sphere, and they are fallen beings. But then because the fallen beings abuse other people, there can be beings who have been exposed to this abuse who have taken on at least elements of the fallen consciousness. But that doesn't mean they have fallen, because this only happens when a sphere is ready to ascend and the ascended masters confront those who aren't ready to ascend, and they give them an opportunity to rise above their consciousness. And if they refuse that opportunity, that's when they fall. So what that means is that when you have fallen, you have a very deep level of denial. But if you have only taken on the fallen consciousness, you don't have that level of denial the same way. And you can see that in the person asking the question. If someone has taken on the fallen consciousness due to immense abuse from a parent, well, if you are even open to the possibility that there's something called the fallen consciousness and that you could have taken it on, you're not a fallen being, because you don't have the denial. If you had denial, you wouldn't even be open to asking the question. And so that means that you've already started identifying that there might be something in your subconscious mind that isn't the highest possible. And that means the conscious you has already started separating yourself from it, or you wouldn't even be able to look for it. And so you simply need to build on that realization, use these tools and techniques that I've talked about, and come to the point where you see that if it is an element of the fallen consciousness, or if it is another illusion that's created a separate self, you just see it, you see the illusion, and you consciously decide to let it die, let it go. It's like I've talked about in other videos about healing trauma. Now, basically what you were exposed to, and you're exposed to abuse, it gives you a trauma. But the trauma is, it really leads you to create this subconscious self, and it's the subconscious self that lingers on in your subconscious mind. And that's why you are suffering from the trauma, because of that subconscious self. So it's a matter of coming to identify it, identify that it's an alien element in your mind, and you come to see what illusion is based on, see what it was actually meant to do for you. Because when you're exposed to abuse, especially as a child, you have to find a way to survive psychologically with the abuse ongoing. And this is what creates the subconscious self. The subconscious self is actually designed to help you deal with the abuse so you can survive psychologically. And that means there are certain things you need to ignore or deny. There are certain beliefs you take on. Oh, this is the kind of person I am. For example, I'm a powerless being. I can't defend myself against this, which could be true when you're a child. But then when you become adult, is it necessarily true? Only if you think it is. So that's what I'm saying. You have to discover what kind of a self you created in reaction to the abuse, what it was designed to do, how it was designed to help you cope with this situation. And then you can come to look at the self and say, okay, I'm not a child anymore. My parent isn't abusing me. I have the option of removing myself from the parent. But I also have the option of identifying the separate self, letting it die, and then I'm actually free of the abuse. The parent may still be doing to you what they were doing when you were a child. But if you let go of the self, it won't have any effect on you. It will not affect you. And conversely, you could say, even if the parent has died, you still have the separate self, which could cause you to abuse your own children. And so if you want to avoid that, you need to also let go of the separate self, which of course will free you also from this constant suffering and this constant denial, because a separate self is always based on a certain form of denial. It's denying something in you. And that is, of course, affecting us when we have this tendency to deny our own higher potential. It's basically you can say that a separate self denies that you have a potential to transcend an outer situation by rising to a higher level of consciousness or a higher degree of personal Christhood. And that obviously limits us when we have that. So part of spiritual growth is overcoming all these subconscious selves that are causing us to deny our highest spiritual potential. Now, just to complete the topic here, when you have been exposed to abuse, you have qualified energy with a fear-based vibration. And that misqualified energy will accumulate in your emotional mind. And it will affect you. It will affect your conscious mind. It will pull on your conscious mind so that in many situations the energy pulls you into reacting with fear or anger or whatever it may be. So in order to be free of the abuse, you also have to do, as I've explained in several videos, you have to invoke high vibration energy from the Ascended Masters, directed into transforming that fear-based energy so you're free from that emotional pull. And so that's the omega aspect of freeing yourself from traumas. And I've experienced it can be tremendously effective. I mean, you can become aware that you have a certain self or a certain psychological issue, a certain trauma, and you start giving these decrees and invocations about it, and as you do, you feel like the pain of looking at the issue is diminished. I've often had, especially when I was younger, you had a certain situation that caused me pain, like even almost a physical pain in my heart when I thought about it. And then after having been invoking light for some time, all of a sudden I can now look at the situation without the pain. And that's of course necessary, because if the pain of a trauma is so severe, how are you going to look for the self? So it's important to keep that in mind, that there's this healing trauma really has two legs. Invoking spiritual light and using tools to come to see the self and let go of the illusion that created the self.